everybody, my name's Matt Hick and I'm Chair of Heritage Volunteering Group and Head of Volunteering with Science Museum Group. I'm going to talk to you today about a tool we've developed to help redeploy volunteers across your organisation. And this is the redeployment framework that you can see on the screen here. I've put the links for this in the box below, so if you'd like to access this spreadsheet, please do so once the video has finished. It's worth saying before I get started that this framework was developed for a devolved volunteer management system. So this is a system where you might act as a volunteer manager and leader of volunteer in your organisation and support colleagues who manage teams of volunteers themselves. If you don't work within that kind of system, you may well need to adopt the framework for yourself. So what I'm going to do is just talk through the 4 different areas of the framework. So role overview, volunteer overview, the timetable, which is just along here, and then some of the remobilisation requirements and considerations that you might have. So if we start with the role overview, what you will see here is a column where you can list all the roles that you have within your organisation and then detail the supervisors of those roles and their senior managers, and of course whether or not they are furloughed or not. And this is really important because it may be that you need to work with those supervisors to find out some of the information that comes later on in the spreadsheet. And of course, if they're on furlough, that's something that you're not going to be able to do. As we move across here into the volunteer overview, what you then see is we'll start to flesh out some of the information around the different roles that we've listed. So we've got team size. We've then got percentage of that team that are over 70. Now this information is basic shielding information and will inform the give us an initial indication about the number of people within that team who can return when the role opens. What we then have is a much more detailed expected return rate. Now this return rate is based on the information that we will garner from the volunteer engagement survey, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Based on this expected return rate, you will then be able to say whether or not this role is able to operate. And this is, of course, directly related to the need for the role to operate. Now, what we have in this last column here is whether or not redeployment is needed. And you'll need to fill this in if the role is required but isn't able to operate because you don't have the right number of volunteers to support you. As we then move across into the remobilisation timetable, this is really to help manage our time as volunteer managers. If you've got a lot of roles, it's going to be very difficult to do the remobilisation planning, certainly the detailed remobilisation planning all at once. So what we suggest here is that you schedule your planning so that it works for you. So if the role is required, it's useful then to put in the date that it's required to start from. In this example, that's the 18th of November. We've then given ourselves 3 months to do the planning, and then we've got the dates back through to May when this timetable was developed, when actually we don't need to specifically focus on work for that role. So that gives us a really useful timetable to think about the work that we're going to need to do. As we move through into the planning phase of that, so the orange coloured dates from August onwards, we can then really start to think about actually what are the role requirements going to be for this role? What are we going to need to change? What are we going to need to put in place? So when, for example, are we going to need to bring the supervisor back from furlough? So with the scheme, as we know, has been extended until the end of October. By bringing back that individual on the 1st of October, they can really start the retraining and the re-welcoming of those volunteers. We can record what that retraining is going to look like in this field here. So that might be an initial welcome, but it may well be that for some roles you need to retrain volunteers directly. You may need to provide specific health and safety training related to coronavirus. That can all be captured in this field here. PPE, so this is the column where we're recording what personal protective equipment our volunteers are going to need to deliver their role safely. And it's going to be important, obviously, for you to work with the line manager of that role in order to ascertain what they will be. Social distancing, so what changes will you make to the role because of social distancing? So in this case, it's gallery support role. We may, for example, move to a single volunteer within that gallery to make sure that it's not overcrowded, that to 2 metre social distancing can be maintained. If you have any ICT accounts that need reactivating for your volunteers for that role to occur, then this is where you can record that information. Any health and safety training that you might be required can be recorded here. And a high-level overview of operational changes can be thought about within this box here. And additional support, this is where we recommend you put in things like emotional support. So if your volunteers are going to need additional help in that area, if perhaps some of their team have been lost to coronavirus, and equally if supervisors are going to need additional emotional support for helping their volunteers through that, that can all be captured in that field. And then last but not least, good old trusty additional information column, where you can really capture anything that isn't hasn't been captured anywhere else in the document. What's really useful for you to think about when you're filling this in is to see this as very much as a live document. So this isn't something that you complete tomorrow and then put away in a drawer and that's it. This is a document that will guide you and your organisation through the redeployment of your volunteer programme and your individual volunteer role. So it's very much an active document for you to use and work on. So now what I'm going to do is share with you a second screen, which is the questionnaire that I mentioned earlier that will help you understand and develop an expected return rate for each of your roles. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen now, and then I'm going to hopefully share another screen with you. So, oops, bear with me 1 second. Here we go. So this is the survey where we are starting to re-engage with our volunteers. Hopefully you've been continued to engage with them throughout this period anyway, but where we really start to understand how people feel about returning to our museums, returning to volunteering, and what support that we might need to put in place to help them through that. So we've put in some initial basic information here, which will allow you to break your survey down importantly into current roles. So you'll be able to analyse all the data that comes out of this survey by the roles, which then means that you can put in the expected return date, return information for each of your roles. As we then move down here, we have then some shielding questions around relating to age and health and ability to return to our museums. So these are questions relating to underlying health conditions, and whether or not anybody in the household is also shielding. It may be that rather than having simple questions like this, you may well, for example, want to relate it to the NHS guidance on clinically vulnerable categories. That could be one way of really kind of making this right and tailored for your organisation. So we move further down. We see here returning to volunteer, so questions about whether or not people would return to volunteer if their role restarts, what concerns them about volunteering, what kind of support and information that they would like us to provide to make them feel more secure in returning to site. And of course, this one could be really helpful for you. If your role doesn't restart immediately, would you consider volunteering in another role within our museums? And I think that's something really important for us to think about, because it may be that many of our roles, particularly back of house and collections roles where our curatorial teams might continue to work from home, might be really difficult for our volunteers to come back on site and undertake their volunteering. If they're happy though to volunteer elsewhere in the museum, they may well be able to support the visitor journey and ensuring that visitors remain safe. So that's a really useful question, I think, to include. If you have been doing volunteer engagement work, you may also want to include that here, because it will provide you with additional guidance around whether or not the engagement work that you've been doing is valued, and if not, how you might change it and adapt it in future. And of course, the good old trusty final question, final thoughts. What I would say at this point is these documents, as I say, are freely available in the link below, so please have a look. However, I think it is really important that you do tailor these questions to your organisation. So make the questions in the survey right for you and your organisation, and maybe also think about adapting the redeployment framework so that it really works for you. The other thing that is really important to consider, certainly with the survey, is that you are asking some very sensitive questions. So if you do have somebody that you can speak to about GDPR, then I would highly recommend that you do that so that the information is both captured safely and securely and stored safely and securely as well. I hope you found this presentation useful and helpful, and all the best with the redeployment of your volunteer programs. If you've enjoyed this, do please join us for our regular Tuesday volunteer coffee afternoons. They take place at 3 p.m. each week. Thank you very much.